2.5 billion years ago, Earth's sky turned green, its oceans turned red, and in a single geological instant, nearly every living thing on this planet suffocated and died. And the killer? It was oxygen. The very gas keeping you alive right now. I know what you're thinking, oxygen is good, how can oxygen be bad? And honestly, when I first came across this story, I had exactly the same reaction. I sat there reading the paper, went back to the top, read it again, and just sat with it for a while. Give me 60 minutes. This one rewired something in my brain. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand why scientists now call this event the closest Earth ever came to becoming a dead, toxic world, like Venus. And why some researchers believe we may be triggering the second version of it right now. Let's go back. All the way back. We're stepping into Earth approximately 3 billion years ago, and I need you to understand that when I say alien world, I don't mean slightly different. I mean a planet so thoroughly unrecognizable that if you were somehow dropped onto its surface, nothing, not a single visual cue, not the color of the sky, not the smell of the air, would register as familiar. There are no continents as we know them. No blue sky. No breathable air. What fills the atmosphere is a thick, chemically complex cocktail: methane, ammonia, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, nitrogen. The sky is almost certainly orange-pink, tinted by a methane haze, the same haze we can observe today on Titan, Saturn's largest moon. If you've seen photographs of Titan's atmosphere from the Cassini mission, you've seen the closest living analog to what ancient Earth looked like from orbit. The oceans existed. But they were warm, iron-rich, and greenish, not from algae, but from dissolved ferrous iron suspended throughout the water column. The entire ocean was essentially a planet-scale chemistry experiment running continuously. No fish. No coral. No movement of any kind that you'd recognize as animal behavior. How do we know any of this? Because the rocks remember. The oldest direct rock evidence comes from the Acasta Gneiss complex in Canada, which gives us material dated to around 4.03 billion years ago. Zircon crystals recovered from the Jack Hills Formation in Western Australia have been dated to 4.4 billion years. These tiny mineral grains survived from an era before most of Earth's current surface even existed. And banded iron formations, extraordinary striped sedimentary rocks found in Western Australia's Pilbara region and in South Africa, are essentially geological photographs of that ancient ocean chemistry. Every stripe of rust in those formations is a record of iron being oxidized and dropping to the seafloor. They are the archive. Now, into this world, something emerged that had a superpower no other organism had yet evolved. Cyanobacteria. They weren't dramatic about it: no teeth, no eyes, no locomotion of any kind. Just mats of microscopic organisms, coating the shallow floors of tidal flats and warm coastal waters. Unremarkable looking. World-ending in their implications. Their superpower was oxygenic photosynthesis. They could split water molecules using sunlight, extract the hydrogen they needed, and release the oxygen as waste. As metabolic exhaust. As something they had no use for and simply expelled. And for over 300 million years, those oxygen molecules went straight into the ocean, where dissolved iron absorbed every single one. The iron acted as a chemical sponge of staggering scale. All that oxygen produced, all those cyanobacterial generations, and essentially none of it reached the atmosphere. The iron just kept absorbing it. The banded iron formations kept accumulating on the seafloor. The system held. I want to digress for just a second, because right now, today, You can fly to Shark Bay in Western Australia and walk along a shoreline where those exact same organisms, Cyanobacteria, are still building stromatolites. Living, breathing, photosynthesizing columns of life that are the direct morphological descendants of the organisms that nearly unmade this planet. You can put your hand on them. They're protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, partly because they're so ancient, and partly, I suspect, because scientists look at them with an expression that's somewhere between reverence and mild existential alarm. That's the kind of thing that recalibrates what ancient actually means. But back to that iron sponge. And the question that changes everything. What happened when the ocean ran out of iron? What happened when the sponge was full? That moment, when the ocean couldn't absorb another molecule of oxygen, is exactly when the world ended. The first time. The iron and Precambrian oceans absorbed cyanobacterial oxygen for somewhere between 300 and 400 million years. Let that number settle. 300 to 400 million years of oxygen being produced and silently neutralized. The geological buffer operated at a scale almost impossible to conceptualize, and it held. Right up until it didn't. The Great Oxidation Event is dated to approximately 2.45 to 2.32 billion years ago. This is the interval when the geological record shows oxygen levels suddenly, dramatically beginning to accumulate in the atmosphere. The iron supply in the oceans had been consumed, oxidized, precipitated out, and layered onto the seafloor as iron oxide. Rust. The banded iron formations themselves are the evidence of the sponge filling up, stripe by stripe, over hundreds of millions of years. Here's how we know the atmospheric transition happened with such precision. Geochemists use something called mass-independent fractionation of sulfur, MIFS, as a chemical proxy. This particular sulfur isotope signature only exists in atmospheres with essentially zero ozone protection. It's locked into sedimentary rocks throughout the Archean era. And then, at around 2.45 billion years ago, it disappears from the record. Permanently. What that disappearance signals is that ozone had begun forming, which means oxygen was accumulating in sufficient quantities to create it. The sulfur signal is one of the sharpest transition markers in all of deep-time geology. The banded iron formations stop appearing in the record at this same point. The sponge had done its job, and then it was done. Now oxygen was free in the atmosphere. And here is where the catastrophe begins, because nearly every organism alive at this moment was anaerobic. They had evolved over billions of years in an oxygen-free world. Their cellular machinery, every enzyme, every membrane, every metabolic pathway, was tuned for a world without oxygen. And oxygen is chemically aggressive in a way that makes it uniquely destructive to biological systems that didn't evolve to handle it. It bonds with organic molecules, strips electrons from proteins and lipids, destroys membrane integrity, generates reactive oxygen species that attack DNA. For anaerobic life, the accumulation of atmospheric oxygen was functionally equivalent to acid rain at the molecular level. Not metaphorically, the chemistry is that straightforward. Picture, if you need a modern frame, the atmosphere composition suddenly shifting to 40% chlorine gas. That is the order of magnitude disruption we're describing for organisms that had never encountered even trace amounts of oxygen. The event that followed is sometimes called the Great Oxidation Catastrophe, deliberately recasting event as catastrophe from the perspective of the organisms that actually experienced it. Anaerobic life, which dominated every ecosystem on this planet, every ocean, every coastal mat, every sediment layer, was driven back to isolated refugia where oxygen couldn't reach. Deep ocean hydrothermal vents, underground sediments, geochemically reducing hot springs. And, in a detail that I find quietly remarkable, animal intestines. The anaerobic bacteria in your digestive system right now, the ones your gut microbiome depends on, are evolutionary refugees from the Great Oxidation Event. They retreated to the one environment they could still survive in, the interior of other organisms. This may have been the largest mass extinction in Earth's entire history, measured by the proportion of existing biodiversity that was eliminated. The event that killed the dinosaurs, the KPG extinction 66 million years ago, is dwarfed by what happened here when judged by the percentage of life on Earth that was eradicated or relegated to biological hiding places. I keep returning to one number from this period, 300 million years. That's how long oxygen was being absorbed before anything visibly changed. 300 million years, longer than the entire duration of dinosaur existence on Earth. And it happened completely silently. No geological explosion, no asteroid, no dramatic rupture. Just chemistry, accumulating invisibly in the dark of the ocean, until one day the buffer was full. That might be the most genuinely unsettling detail in this entire story. Not the catastrophe itself. The silence that preceded it. But oxygen in the atmosphere was only the beginning. Because that new, reactive gas now filling the sky was about to do something that made the mass extinction look like a prelude. It was about to freeze the entire planet. Not partially. Not in polar regions. Completely, wall to wall, pole to equator, ocean surface to the bottom. And this is where Earth nearly stopped being Earth at all. To understand what happened next, you need to know something about the Archean atmosphere that most people never think about. The ancient Earth was kept warm, kept liquid, kept habitable, not primarily by the sun, but by an extraordinarily thick blanket of methane in the atmosphere. This methane was produced continuously by the same anaerobic organisms that cyanobacteria were killing. It was their metabolic output, just as oxygen was cyanobacteria's metabolic output. Two competing biospheres, each maintaining the atmospheric conditions that the other was trying to destroy. Methane is a greenhouse gas roughly 80 times more potent than CO2 over 20-year timescales. The Archean methane blanket was thick enough to compensate for the fact that the early sun was about 20 to 30% less luminous than it is today, a puzzle known as the faint young sun paradox. Methane solved that paradox. It held the warmth in. When oxygen began accumulating in the atmosphere, it reacted with that methane. Oxygen destroys atmospheric methane through a relatively straightforward chain of chemical reactions, converting it to carbon dioxide and water vapor. And here is where the chain of catastrophe unfolds with terrible logic. CO2 is a greenhouse gas, yes, but a far weaker one than methane. The atmospheric swap from methane to CO2 triggered a collapse in the greenhouse effect. Temperatures plummeted. And the geological record of what followed is preserved in formations on every continent, including at locations that were near the equator at the time, the Huronian glaciation. Dated to approximately 2.4 to 2.1 billion years ago, the Huronian represents the most severe ice age in Earth's documented history. Diamictites, deposits of glacial till, unsorted rock debris dragged and dropped by glaciers, appear in the rock record at latitudes that, accounting for continental drift, were near the equatorial zone. Glaciation at sea level in the tropics, that is the definition of Snowball Earth conditions. Global average surface temperatures may have approached -50 degrees Celsius. Ice sheets potentially 1 to 2 kilometers thick over ocean surfaces that are today blue water. The entire hydrological cycle, evaporation, rainfall, river runoff, essentially shut down under ice. Now here is the feedback loop that makes this scenario almost irreversible once initiated. Fresh snow and ice reflect approximately 90% of incoming solar radiation back into space. Ocean water, by contrast, absorbs around 94% of solar energy. Once ice begins forming at low latitudes, the planetary albedo, the reflectivity of Earth's surface, increases dramatically. More reflection means less heat absorbed. Less heat absorbed means lower temperatures. Lower temperatures mean more ice formation. More ice means higher albedo. The loop is self-reinforcing, and in climate modeling, it runs away from any equilibrium almost immediately after it begins. Scientists call this the ice albedo feedback. Once it crosses a threshold, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop from the outside. I want to be honest with you here, because science is more complicated than documentary voiceovers usually admit. The full Snowball Earth hypothesis is still actively debated. Some researchers argue it was more of a slush ball, not completely frozen, maintaining thin liquid zones near the equator. The evidence for complete global glaciation versus partial glaciation is genuinely contested in the literature. But even the conservative models, even the most skeptical assessments, show something that would be utterly unrecognizable as the Earth we know. I'll use snowball as a useful shorthand, but the nuance is real, and you deserve to know it. What survived? Life didn't vanish entirely, and understanding where it persisted matters enormously for what came next. Hydrothermal vents provided geothermal heat independent of solar input, pockets of liquid water sustained by Earth's internal energy, completely decoupled from the frozen surface above. Thin ice zones near volcanic islands and geothermal regions may have maintained photosynthetic capacity. Cyanobacteria, with their extraordinary metabolic flexibility, appear to have survived, possibly in liquid water trapped beneath thin, translucent ice layers, where some fraction of sunlight still penetrated. Every complex organism alive today, every insect, every vertebrate, every tree, descends from whatever scraped through in those refugia. We are the biological grandchildren of the survivors of a near-total planetary extinction. That's not dramatic embellishment. That's what the evolutionary record implies when you trace ancestry backward through the Huronian. And here is where the Venus comparison crystallizes into something genuinely instructive. Venus was destroyed by a runaway greenhouse effect, too much warmth, a positive feedback in the heating direction that vaporized its oceans and baked its surface to 465 degrees Celsius. Earth, during the Huronian, came within range of the opposite catastrophe, a runaway icehouse, a positive feedback in the cooling direction that threatened to lock the planet's surface in permanent ice. The furnace on one side, the frozen tomb on the other. Earth threaded a needle between them. And it did it, ultimately, through geology. Volcanoes saved the world. But in saving it, they created something entirely new, and that new world would eventually give rise to something completely unprecedented in Earth's history. But first, the ice had to break. Here is what's remarkable about the escape from Snowball Earth: it didn't require any external rescue. No asteroid, no solar flare, no intervention of any kind. Earth's own internal machinery did the work. Beneath the kilometers of surface ice, the planet's tectonic and volcanic systems continued operating, completely indifferent to the frozen conditions above. Volcanoes kept erupting. Seafloor spreading kept releasing CO2 through outgassing. And here is the critical asymmetry that saved life on Earth. On a fully glaciated planet, the rock weathering cycle, which normally removes CO2 from the atmosphere by reacting with exposed minerals and rainfall, is completely shut down. Rock weathering requires liquid water on exposed rock surfaces. No liquid water, no weathering, no CO2 removal. So volcanic CO2 kept accumulating in the atmosphere, but the usual removal mechanism was frozen out of operation. Over millions of years, and we're talking somewhere in the range of tens of millions of years of this imbalance, CO2 concentrations built toward levels estimated at 350 to 400 times higher than today's atmospheric concentration. At that point, the greenhouse effect overwhelmed the ice albedo feedback. The ice began melting. And then the feedback reversed, violently. As ice retreated, dark ocean surfaces were exposed, absorbing solar energy rather than reflecting it. More heat, more melt, more absorption. Climate models suggest global average temperatures may have swung from around -50 Celsius to +50 Celsius within as little as 1,000 to 10,000 years, a temperature oscillation of roughly 100 degrees by geological measure, in what amounts to an eye blink. Catastrophic warmth, torrential rainfall, continent-scale flooding as ice sheets collapsed. The chemistry of the aftermath set up the next chapter of the story. Nutrient runoff from the newly exposed land surfaces flooded the warming oceans. Phosphorus, nitrogen, iron, all the building blocks of biological productivity. Cyanobacteria, having survived the glaciation in their refugia, found suddenly rich, warm, nutrient-saturated oceans. Biological productivity surged. Research published in Nature Geoscience by Ostrander and colleagues in 2020, using chromium and iron isotope data from Archean shales, provided evidence for a two-step oxygenation model, an initial rise at 2.45 billion years ago, followed by a second major increase at approximately 2.22 billion years ago after the Huronian. The classic single-event GOE narrative is, in the researcher's own assessment, an oversimplification. The science keeps getting more detailed, more surprising, more humbling, and honestly, that's one of the reasons I find this material impossible to stop reading about. I want to pause on something, though, because I think we rush past it too quickly. The organisms that caused the catastrophe survived the catastrophe they caused. Cyanobacteria triggered the largest extinction in Earth's history, drove the planet into a near-total glaciation, survived that glaciation, and then, when conditions improved, resumed exactly what they'd been doing before. Producing oxygen. Today they are in your backyard, in your local lake, in every ocean surface layer on Earth. They are 3.5 billion years old as a lineage, and they have outlasted 99.9% of every species that has ever lived. There's something darkly philosophical in that persistence that I haven't fully resolved. The thaw didn't just rescue life, it fundamentally upgraded it. Because in the oxygen-richer world that emerged, something became chemically possible that had been impossible before. Something that would eventually lead to eyes, brains, motion, and complexity. To us. But before that, the oxygen that killed almost everything had one more catastrophe to deliver. And this one is personal. This one is inside you, right now, in every cell you have. Every cell in your body, with the exception of red blood cells, contains mitochondria. You probably knew that. What you may not have fully absorbed is what mitochondria actually are, in terms of their origin. They are not structures that your cells evolved internally. They were, approximately 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, free-living bacteria, alpha proteobacteria, that were engulfed by a larger archaeal host cell. Instead of being digested, they formed a partnership. The host provided protection and structural support. The bacterium provided something extraordinary in return, the ability to generate cellular energy using oxygen with a previously impossible efficiency. This is endosymbiosis, Lynn Margulis's theory, first proposed in 1967, initially dismissed, turned down by 15 journals before it was published, and now considered one of the foundational insights of evolutionary biology. The mitochondria in your heart cells at this moment are the direct descendants of bacteria that survived the Great Oxidation Event. They are evolutionary refugees that found shelter inside another cell and, over 1.5 billion years of coevolution, became so integrated that neither party can survive without the other. The energy mathematics of this partnership are staggering. Anaerobic respiration, fermentation, yields approximately 2 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. Aerobic respiration using oxygen, running through mitochondria, yields approximately 36 to 38 ATP. That is roughly an 18-fold increase in energy efficiency from a single metabolic innovation. 2 ATP to 36. The difference between barely surviving and having enough surplus energy to build a nervous system, coordinate billions of specialized cells, maintain a constant body temperature, and sustain the metabolic cost of a large, complex brain. Without the GOE, without that oxygen accumulating in the atmosphere, the chemical conditions for this energy revolution would not have existed. Mitochondria are not just interesting evolutionary history. They are the mechanistic reason complex multicellular life was able to exist at all. Margulis herself is worth a moment's attention here. She spent years being told that her framework was wrong, that competition, not cooperation between organisms, was the engine of evolution. She was right. The textbook rewrote itself, reluctantly and over decades. Science does self-correct. It just sometimes requires someone willing to keep insisting on evidence that the consensus isn't ready to accept. The mitochondria in your cells are the permanent, physical proof of her patience. The oxygen timeline from this era forward tells the rest of the story in numbers. At 3.0 billion years ago, atmospheric oxygen was below 0.001%, trace amounts only. The GOE begins at 2.45 billion years ago, and oxygen starts accumulating. By 2.1 billion years ago, it reaches roughly 1 to 2%. By 600 million years ago, approximately 5 to 10%. And by 541 million years ago, the threshold of the Cambrian explosion, oxygen was at somewhere between 10 and 15% of the atmosphere, sufficient to support active, mobile, large-bodied organisms with high metabolic demands. The Cambrian explosion is the most dramatic proliferation of animal body plans in Earth's history, dozens of fundamentally different anatomical architectures appearing in the fossil record within a geologically compressed interval. Eyes, limbs, shells, predator-prey dynamics, complex nervous systems. All of it dependent on the atmospheric oxygen levels that the GOE, and the subsequent oxygenation events, had built up over hundreds of millions of years. Direct causal chain, Cyanobacteria produce oxygen as waste product. GOE poisons anaerobic world. Snowball Earth triggered by methane collapse. Volcanic CO2 breaks the freeze. Postglacial oceans flood with nutrients. Eukaryotes evolve. Mitochondria form. Aerobic energy surplus enables multicellular complexity. Cambrian explosion. Every animal that has ever lived, including the one reading this. Every fish. Every insect. Every dinosaur. Every human being. All of it is a downstream consequence of what those cyanobacteria did 2.4 billion years ago, with no awareness, no intention, and no concept of consequence. And before we move forward in time, the most unsettling sentence I've encountered in this entire body of research: scientists have a term for what cyanobacteria did to the Archean Earth. They call it an ecological catastrophe caused by a biological success story. Read that again, slowly. We're going to come back to that phrase. And the second time, it's going to land differently. Now let me show you the pattern. Because the Great Oxidation Event was not an isolated event in Earth's history. It was the first entry in a recurring sequence, a pattern of biological organisms altering atmospheric chemistry at planetary scale, with mass extinction as the result, followed eventually by the emergence of something more complex than what existed before. The second entry in the pattern is less famous but equally consequential. Approximately 375 million years ago, land plants, which had colonized the continents in the preceding tens of millions of years, had evolved deep root systems capable of penetrating and breaking down rock. Those roots, combined with the organic acids produced by associated fungi, dramatically accelerated the chemical weathering of continental rock. Weathering pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. Land plants were also consuming CO2 through photosynthesis at a scale the planet had never experienced. CO2 levels crashed. Temperatures dropped. The cooling triggered glaciation, ocean anoxia, and a late Devonian mass extinction, approximately 75% of all species lost. Biology altered the atmosphere. The atmosphere responded catastrophically. Recovery took millions of years. 2 data points make a line. 3 confirm a pattern. The third entry is the one you're living in. Pre-industrial atmospheric CO2 was approximately 280 parts per million. As of 2024, it sits at roughly 424 ppm, the highest concentration in at least 3 to 5 million years, from ice core and sedimentary proxy records. The rate of increase, approximately 2.5 ppm per year. For context, the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, occurring around 56 million years ago and considered one of the most rapid natural warming events in the Cenozoic geological record, shows a CO2 increase rate of approximately 0.3 ppm per year. The current rate is roughly 10 times faster than the fastest natural climate perturbation in the past 66 million years. The GOE unfolded over hundreds of millions of years, an evolutionary timescale, one that allowed biological systems to adapt through natural selection, slowly shifting toward the new chemistry. Current atmospheric change is unfolding on a timescale measured in decades. No evolutionary adaptation is possible on that schedule. Natural selection cannot operate in 100 years. Ocean acidification adds another dimension. Since industrialization, ocean pH has dropped from approximately 8.2 to 8.1. The logarithmic nature of the pH scale means this represents roughly a 30% increase in acidity. The rate of acidification is estimated to be 10 times faster than at any point in the last 300 million years, including the KPG extinction event. The Venus comparison, which I introduced at the beginning of this story as a kind of thematic frame, earns its place here. Venus and Earth formed under similar conditions, comparable size, mass, and original position relative to the early Sun. Venus's surface temperature is 465 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt lead. Its atmosphere is 96.5% CO2. Recent modeling work suggests Venus may have maintained liquid water oceans for up to 2 to 3 billion years before a runaway greenhouse effect locked it into its current state, roughly 700 million years ago. Not a primordially hostile world, a world that was potentially habitable for billions of years, until the chemistry tipped past a threshold it couldn't recover from. The GOE showed that Earth's own biology, operating through ordinary metabolic processes, can push planetary atmospheric chemistry toward states incompatible with the life that created those conditions. That's not alarmism. That's the direct lesson of the rock record, as interpreted by Dr. Lee Kump at Penn State, by Timothy Lyons, Noah Planavsky, and Christopher Reinhardt in their Oxygen Timeline Synthesis published in Nature in 2014, and by dozens of other researchers who have spent careers reading the chemistry written in ancient sediments. I'll link those papers in the description. I think it matters that you can verify everything being said here. These are not fringe positions. I want to be clear about something, though, because I want this to land right. I'm not trying to deposit dread and leave. Understanding deep time, sitting with what Earth has already survived, actually produces something different from despair. Not optimism exactly, something more like a clear-eyed respect. for the scale of what's at stake, and for the weight of what we now understand about it. That clarity is, I think, more useful than either panic or denial. But we've been in catastrophe territory for a while now. Let me show you the twist, because embedded in the research on the Great Oxidation Event is a discovery that upended the conventional timeline and changed what we think we know about when all of this actually began. Somewhere in the rocks of Western Australia, there's a chemical signature that shouldn't exist. It's 2.7 billion years old, 250 million years before the GOE. And it changes everything we thought we knew about when oxygen first appeared on this planet. In 2007, Roger Buick and colleagues at the University of Washington published research that found trace chemical signatures of oxygen in shales dated to 2.7 billion years ago, a quarter billion years before the conventional GOE date. These weren't ambiguous signals. They found biomarkers called 2-methylhopanoids, which are specifically associated with cyanobacteria, along with geochemical proxies consistent with localized oxygen production. The implication was both straightforward and deeply disruptive to the standard narrative. Cyanobacteria were producing oxygen at least 250 million years before it accumulated in the atmosphere. This is what researchers now call the whiffs of oxygen hypothesis. Small, periodic, geographically localized increases in oxygen that were rapidly consumed by reactions with iron in seawater, by oxidation of volcanic gases, by the chemical reduction capacity of the Archean Ocean, without ever building up to atmospheric concentrations. The oxygen was there. It just kept getting absorbed. Which immediately raises the question that dominated the subsequent decade of research: why the 250 million year delay? Why did oxygen not accumulate for so long after cyanobacteria began producing it? Several competing hypotheses have been developed, and honest reporting requires acknowledging that the debate isn't fully settled. The hydrogen escape model, developed by David Catling and colleagues in a 2001 science paper, proposes that early Earth was releasing hydrogen gas rapidly enough to continuously consume atmospheric oxygen. Only when hydrogen escape rates slowed did oxygen begin building up. James Casting's volcanic flux hypothesis holds that early volcanoes were releasing more chemically reduced gases, hydrogen sulfide, SO2, molecular hydrogen, than today's volcanoes do, acting as a continuous oxygen sink. As volcanic outgassing composition shifted over geological time, the sink weakened and oxygen began to accumulate. A third framework, the biological threshold model, suggests that cyanobacteria simply needed hundreds of millions of years to spread across enough ocean surface area that their collective oxygen production rate exceeded the combined consumption rate of all available chemical sinks. The mystery isn't why the GOE happened. The mystery is why it took so long. That's the honest state of the science. And the revisions don't stop at the pre-GOE whiffs. Noah Planavsky and colleagues published research in Science in 2014 demonstrating evidence for a mid-Proterozoic oxygen plateau, extremely low oxygen persisting for approximately 1 billion years after the GOE, before the second major oxygenation event. The textbook story, Oxygen Rose, Complex Life Evolved, is dramatically compressed from the actual sequence. The real history ran slower, with more false starts, more oxygen drawdowns, more dead ends than the simplified narrative allows. The GOE itself, the scientific community now largely accepts, should be understood as a transition interval spanning potentially 200 million years or more, not a single moment, not an event in the sharp sense that word implies. Multiple partial oxygenations, multiple reversals. And the Neo-Proterozoic oxygenation event, occurring around 800 to 550 million years ago, was possibly more directly important for animal evolution than the original GOE. It's the oxygenation pulse that brought atmospheric levels up to the range that enabled the Cambrian explosion. So when you see the Great Oxidation Event in headlines, know that event is carrying an enormous amount of narrative weight on very complex underlying geology. Here is what I call this: a space documentary, and I know, technically, Earth's deep history isn't space in the orbital sense. But here's my honest thinking on that: understanding planetary chemistry, atmospheric dynamics, the conditions that allow life to emerge and persist, that is planetary science. That is the discipline that tells us what to look for in the atmosphere of an exoplanet transit spectrum, what the biosignatures on Mars might look like if they exist, what the presence of methane on a distant world might or might not imply. Earth is the best studied planet we have. Its 4.5 billion year history is our deepest data set for what planetary life looks like, and what threatens it. Now let me tell you what I think is the single most extraordinary thing in all of this research, and I don't reach for that kind of language carelessly. There was no intelligence directing any of this. No design, no committee, no awareness at any level. A single-celled photosynthesizing organism, one that has no nervous system, no behavior in any meaningful sense, no capacity for intention, accidentally terraformed an entire planet. It triggered the largest mass extinction in Earth's history. It froze the world. It survived the freeze. And in doing so, it created the atmospheric chemistry that made neurons possible. That made eyes possible. That made curiosity possible. The fact that you are somewhere right now, processing these words, wanting to understand what happened 2.4 billion years ago, is a direct, traceable, chemical and biological consequence of what cyanobacteria did without knowing they were doing anything at all. That is not poetry dressed up as science. That is chemistry, and biology, and time. And it might be the most astonishing thing I've ever spent weeks trying to understand. Now hold that. Because we're going to come back to that phrase, ecological catastrophe caused by a biological success story, and it's going to land exactly as heavily as I warned you it would. Cyanobacteria were a biological success story. They thrived. They spread across every ocean on Earth. They outcompete every competitor in their ecological niche. And in doing so, they poisoned their own world. Not maliciously, they had no awareness of consequences. They simply did what successful organisms do: grew, reproduced, metabolized. The side effect happened to be civilizational scale. Planetary scale. The side effect happened to be the near-permanent alteration of conditions for all other life on Earth. Sound familiar? Pre-industrial CO2, 280 ppm. Current CO2 as of 2024, approximately 424 ppm, highest in at least 3 to 5 million years. Rate of increase, faster than any geological event in the Cenozoic record. Ocean pH drop since industrialization, 30% more acidic. Rate of acidification, 10 times faster than at any point in the last 300 million years. Current species loss rate, 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rate documented in the fossil record. The sixth mass extinction is not a future prediction. It's an ongoing measurement. The GOE teaches something specific and important about what these numbers mean. Feedback loops, once triggered, can be irreversible on any timescale relevant to the organisms living through them. When oxygen accumulated to the point where atmospheric methane was being chemically destroyed faster than anaerobic organisms could produce it, there was no recovery path. The methane blanket was gone. The warming it had provided was gone. The ice came, and no single organism, no population, no ecosystem had any mechanism to reverse the process. The world had permanently changed, and the organisms most affected by the change had no tools to understand that it was happening, let alone to respond. The current concern that most directly echoes GOE dynamics is the Arctic methane situation. Permafrost soils across Siberia, Alaska, and Canada contain approximately 1,500 gigatons of carbon stored in frozen organic matter. Methane clathrates, ice-like structures trapping methane molecules on Arctic seafloors, represent an additional reservoir of uncertain but potentially comparable scale. As Arctic temperatures rise, the Arctic is currently warming roughly 4 times faster than the global average. Permafrost thaws. Thawing permafrost releases carbon as both CO2 and methane. Released methane drives additional warming. Additional warming drives additional thaw. The structure of the feedback loop is identical to the ice albedo feedback that drove Snowball Earth, self-reinforcing, directional, and very difficult to reverse once a threshold is crossed. Earth won't become Venus in our lifetimes. Almost certainly not in the next million years. The geological and chemical conditions are too different, and Venus's state required a specific sequence of events involving total water loss that Earth is far from replicating. But the GOE demonstrates, beyond any reasonable interpretive doubt, that biological processes can push a planet's atmospheric chemistry towards states incompatible with the life that created those conditions. Probably, and almost certainly, are doing a lot of work in that sentence. And the lesson of deep time is that planetary systems don't announce their thresholds in advance. I want to pause and tell you something honestly. When I first mapped out this video, I wasn't planning to make the Cyanobacteria to human parallel this explicit. It felt too pointed, maybe too like editorializing. But the primary literature kept placing the parallel directly in front of me, in the language of the researchers themselves. Ecological catastrophe caused by a biological success story is not my framing. That phrasing comes from the peer-reviewed literature. So I kept it. I think understanding what happened 2.4 billion years ago is one of the most useful frames available for understanding what is being measured right now in atmospheric observatories, in ocean pH sensors, in permafrost monitoring stations across the Arctic. Make of that what you will. But I don't want to end this story in dread. Because the GOE, for all its catastrophe, has one more thing to teach. And it's the most important thing. It's about what Earth has already survived. After the GOE and the Huronian glaciation, life required somewhere between 200 and 300 million years to fully diversify into new ecological complexity. After the extinction event that ended the dinosaurs, ecosystems recovered and mammals diversified within approximately 10 million years. After the Permian-Triassic extinction, which eliminated roughly 96% of all marine species and around 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species, the most severe extinction event in the fossil record, recovery took somewhere between 10 and 30 million years. The pattern holds across all 5 confirmed mass extinctions. Recovery timescale scales with severity. The deeper the wound, the longer the healing. Earth has no survival instinct. It has no will, no preference for biological diversity over sterility. It simply has chemistry, and physics, and time. And yet, it has recovered. Every single time. Not to what existed before, but to something. Always to something. Life emerged on Earth within roughly 300 to 600 million years of the planet's formation, as soon as stable liquid water existed at the surface. Life survived the late heavy bombardment between 4.1 and 3.8 billion years ago, a period of intense asteroid and comet impacts severe enough to repeatedly vaporize shallow oceans. Life survived the GOE. Life survived Snowball Earth. Life survived 5 confirmed mass extinctions over 540 million years of complex animal evolution. The data suggests something clear: life, once established on a planet with liquid water and basic chemistry, is extraordinarily difficult to completely eradicate. Individual species, including the technologically sophisticated, self-aware ones, are considerably more fragile. The distinction matters. The practical takeaways from the GOE aren't abstract. First, feedback loops are real, geological scale, and can be initiated by ordinary biological activity. Understanding them is not alarmism, it is the application of geological literacy to present conditions. Second, the organisms that cause an extinction event rarely lead the recovery. Anaerobic life caused the GOE. It was the organisms most threatened by the oxygen accumulation. The organisms that caused the Permian-Triassic extinction are debated, but the species that thrived in its aftermath were not the dominant organisms of the Permian. The causal agent of a planetary perturbation and the beneficiary of the subsequent New World are almost never the same. Third, the GOE produced a richer, more energetically diverse biosphere than existed before it. Destruction and creation are structurally linked at planetary scale. Every mass extinction in Earth's history has been followed by diversification into the vacated ecological space. Fourth, deep time provides proportion. Our current crisis is real, it is measurably serious, and it is operating at unprecedented speed, but it is happening on a planet with 4.5 billion years of demonstrated resilience. Return with me to Shark Bay, Western Australia. Those living stromatolites, the ones you can actually visit, in a shallow turquoise bay surrounded by eucalyptus and salt flats. Those organisms are 3.5 billion years old as a lineage. They don't know they changed the world. They have no record of the Huronian glaciation they triggered, no memory of the mass extinction their oxygen caused, no awareness of the complex life they made possible. They grow. They photosynthesize. They release oxygen as waste. They have been doing this, continuously, since before the Earth had a moon of its current size. They have outlasted, by an enormous margin, 99.9% of every species that has ever appeared in the fossil record. There's something grounding in that. Something that recalibrates the scale of things without diminishing the urgency of the present. I study this material because I find it genuinely transformative, and not in the motivational poster sense. Transformative in the sense that it changes the proportions of things. After spending time in deep time, the permanent feels less permanent. The unprecedented feels more comprehensible. The weight of the present moment becomes clearer, not lighter, clearer because it's now set against the actual backdrop of what this planet has already navigated. I don't know what the correct human response to all of this is, and I want to be honest about that. I'm not a climate policy researcher. I'm not a planetary scientist. I'm someone who reads the papers, follows the citations, and tries to translate what the researchers are actually saying into language that doesn't require a geology PhD to follow. What I'm confident about is that understanding the problem in its full depth, including its deep time context, including the GOE, including the Venus comparison, including what feedback loops actually look like when they run, is a prerequisite for engaging with it honestly. Let me bring this all the way together now. Because we've covered 2.4 billion years of Earth history, and I want the core of the story to land with the clarity it deserves. 6 sentences. The entire story of the Great Oxidation Event. Cyanobacteria evolved oxygenic photosynthesis and began releasing oxygen into iron-rich Archean oceans. For 300 million years, dissolved iron absorbed every molecule of oxygen they produced, invisibly, silently, without any visible surface effect. When the iron was exhausted, oxygen entered the atmosphere, poisoning dominant anaerobic life, chemically destroying the methane greenhouse, and triggering Snowball Earth. Volcanoes slowly loaded CO2 into the atmosphere under the ice until the greenhouse tipped, the ice collapsed in catastrophic warmth, and the frozen world thawed. In the post-glacial, oxygen-enriched oceans, eukaryotes developed, mitochondrial endosymbiosis occurred, and complex multicellular life became chemically possible for the first time. The catastrophe that nearly ended Earth's biological experiment turned out to be the exact prerequisite for everything that came after, including whatever is happening in your mind right now as you process these words. Here is the core insight, stated once, as precisely as I can. The Great Oxidation Event is the story of how the most successful species in Earth's history accidentally almost destroyed the conditions for complex life, and in doing so, accidentally created them. It is a story about unintended consequences operating at planetary scale. It is a story about chemistry, time, and the extraordinary resilience embedded in Earth's systems. And for the first time in 2.4 billion years, it has an audience capable of understanding its implications while the implications are still unfolding. That audience is us. That moment is now. Earth nearly became Venus. Not through an asteroid impact, not through a solar event, through biology. Through the ordinary metabolic activity of organisms that were simply doing what successful organisms do. Venus is the warning that a world with similar starting conditions can cross an atmospheric threshold and never come back. Deep time is the teacher that shows us what crossing those thresholds looks like from the inside. And we, in a coincidence of timing that is either fortunate or cruel, depending on what we do with it, are the generation that gets to read the textbook while the exam is being administered. I've been working on this video for weeks. Following citations at 2 a.m., reading papers on chromium isotope proxies and sulfur mass-independent fractionation and mitochondrial endosymbiosis, trying to find the right thread through 2.4 billion years of planetary history. I hope it gave you something, a new frame for something you thought you already understood, a number worth holding on to, a reason to go verify the primary sources linked in the description. In this documentary, we stepped into Earth's most dangerous chapter, not the age of dinosaurs, not the asteroid impact, but the quiet, microscopic revolution of cyanobacteria that reshaped everything we thought we knew about how life and atmosphere interact. We traced the chemistry of catastrophe through the Iron Ocean, the methane collapse, the frozen world, the volcanic rescue, the mitochondrial revolution, and the modern mirror that the data keeps placing in front of us. And we asked, honestly, whether the pattern is repeating. The most important thing deep time teaches isn't fear. It's proportion. Earth has survived things that make our current trajectory look modest in geological scale, but it survived them over timescales measured in millions of years, not decades. We don't have millions of years. We have something cyanobacteria never had, the knowledge to see the pattern while we're still inside it. What we do with that knowledge is the part that's still being written. If this gave you something worth keeping, a frame, a number, a question you'll carry around for a while, the best thing you can do is share it with someone who'd find it as interesting as you did. Not for the algorithm. Because these ideas deserve a wider audience, and the peer-reviewed sources for everything covered here are in the description so you can go as deep as you want. If planetary scale science told without the dumbing down is what you want more of, then this channel is where we do it. Next time, we're going forward on the timeline instead of backward. In approximately 600 million years, Earth's increasing solar luminosity will trigger its own version of a runaway greenhouse effect, and life on land will become impossible, not from anything we do, but from the ordinary aging of a star. How life ends on Earth, naturally and on a schedule we can already calculate to reasonable precision, is next. It's equally fascinating, and depending on your temperament, equally unsettling. Until then, stay curious. The universe is considerably older and stranger than any of us have fully reckoned with, and the rocks have been keeping records the whole time.